acknowledging the past and going, well, trans people there were like me, and they went to the cinema and they saw the same thing, and maybe they felt the same way as me. So I think it's a connection of between identity and community in a way. But looking at that again and going, I can see myself in that, you know, Frankenstein, even like Body Snatchers, you know, classic sort of horror films that look at, again, body horror. Until we have more trans directors, until there is a bigger space for trans people to actually express themselves, look at the history, look back and go, oh my god, trans people were there when that happened, and they probably saw the same thing.
What's your favourite scary movie?
As a trans person, I've always been interested in horror. While my peers watched horror movies and felt scared, I often watched them and felt comforted. And I'm not alone. Over the years, I've met countless other trans people who have found comfort in the horror genre. Over the last few years, we've seen a rise of trans authors publishing horror books. Alison Rumfitt, Gretchen Felker-Martin, Andrew Joseph White. And in the world of film, we recently saw the release of I Saw the TV Glow, a film about the horror of trans repression. But what is it about horror that draws so many trans people to the genre? What is it about the demonic possessions and grotesque transformations that make so many of us feel so seen? I talked to the researcher Ty Williamson to find out more.
So I'm Ty, my pronouns are they, them, and I am a master's student at Christchurch, and I'm doing a master's in film theory, specifically transgender horror. So the three case studies that I'm looking at in my thesis is Hereditary by Ari Aster, Titan by Julia de Cornell, and We're All Going to the World's Fair by Jane Schoenbrunn. Jane Schoenbrunn's work, they've just released another film, I Saw the TV Glow, and they're non-binary. They came out during the filming of We're All Going to the World's Fair, and it was a lot of sort of, they looked at trans youth and sort of the experience of the internet, you know, watching YouTube horror films, and how a lot of trans kids really got into that scene because they saw sort of reflections of themselves. They saw an exploration and an escape of their sort of body and identity, and going into this digital world and being someone different and transforming and not really knowing who you are. With Hereditary, I look at sort of the themes of possession and how this sort of spirit is desperate for a male body. Historically, it is a male demon that's only sort of powerful when it's in a male form, but it keeps going into female bodies. So I sort of follow with the physical representation of possession and transformation of their body. And with Titan, again, it's a lot of sort of body horror, which I think is a huge thing for trans people who love horror. And yeah, the director themselves have said that the main character is someone who is gender fluid in a way, and it's sort of an expression of, I guess, gender euphoria and passing and going into trans themes that are not necessarily human. I look at sort of transfuturism, transhumanism, and sort of the technological aspects of transforming your body, and how a lot of people, again, a lot of trans people relate to that, of basically literally becoming something beyond human, sort of robotic and cyborgs, really, trans cyborgs, which I think is really cool.
Horror has always been used to explore different political and social ideas, whether that's racism in Jordan Peele's Get Out, class in Brian Yuzna's Society, radicalisation through the media in David Cronenberg's Videodrome, or female sexuality and empowerment in Julia de Cornell's Raw. Currently, trans rights are the hot topic in politics, with 4,780 transgender hate crimes reported in 2023/24, a significant rise from the 2,799 reported in 2020/21. In 2023, the Labour Party dropped their pledge to introduce self-identification for trans people, which would have been a huge step forward for trans rights. Currently, trans people's lives and bodies are being increasingly politicised, and during the 2024 UK general election, candidates were asked endlessly about their opinions on the trans community. Recently, the UK has seen the ban of puberty blockers for under 18s, taking away a much-needed resource for young trans people. With trans rights and bodily autonomy being eroded, it is becoming increasingly easy to connect our own lived experiences to the horror narratives we know and love.
So, horror's always been political. I mean, ever since it was created, you know, sort of the vampire stories are commentaries on queer people and the AIDS crisis. Looking, you know, more towards modern day horror, you've got Jordan Peele, and who was one of the most political horror filmmakers of this generation. And I believe as horror develops, like most, you know, sort of media, it is always commentating on what's going on around us. And right now, it is a lot of commentary on trans people. It is the moment, trans people and trans politics in America, in England, all over the world. It's what we're talking about, it's what we're being subjected to. So I feel like horror is moving towards that aspect of gender exploration and sort of commentating on how trans people are, how they feel, how they're being treated.
After talking to Ty, I wanted to speak to someone writing their own trans horror stories.
I am William A. Wellman. I am a horror writer and podcast creator. I write and record a weekly horror fiction podcast centered on sort of queer themes called Hello from the Hallowoods.
William's podcast has over 100 episodes and has won multiple awards for writing, sound design, and voice acting.
It's a show that delves a lot into gender identity and internal conflicts of characters, and at the same time hosts a lot of vampires and ghosts and Frankenstein's monsters, sort of navigating life at the end of the world. We see a lot of trying to deal with the ramifications of these things from characters who are either monstrous to start with and trying to understand why they have this nature and what how they're going to kind of manifest that in the world and how they're going to deal with other people's perception of them, other people's stigma or bias around the fact that on the surface they are something that they find scary. And then for others, especially those who were not like initially monstrous in the story, there is this kind of grappling with the transformation that is afoot and realizing that there is an internal nature that is finding its way to the surface, that they have to kind of adjust their expectations of themselves and the way that they see themselves, and maybe even deal with bias or stigma that they had against people different from them at the start of the show, as they realize they too fall into that category as it goes on. There's often a parallel between I say monstrosity, but having the elements of these sort of monster tropes, and queerness itself in various flavors.
Trans people in society have always been viewed as something sort of monstrous and, I guess, evil, with creatures that are unknown to cis people. And as much as that can be like a negative thing, it is really empowering to take the negative stuff and make it into positive. The queer community has done that for as long as it's existed, which is forever, is taking, you know, sort of derogatory things and going, well, it's mine now, I reclaim it, I take power in it.
I found horror a really fascinating genre to look at, where through the metaphor of whatever the monster or the source of the horror is, you can kind of talk about things in a way that gets beyond people's expectations or gets them to think about things differently.
you can make a monster, you can, you know, with violence and gore, you can do anything with horror, and it's not the same as other genres. So there is such a big space for trans people to come in, and it is just that need of acceptance and uplifting their creativity.
So when it came to the Hallowoods, I really wanted to both work through and talk about queer identity. I wanted to navigate complex feelings. And I wanted to explore a lot of things I found troubling. And the ability to do that through a story that uses horror as its canvas a little bit. And can talk about things sometimes directly, but also sometimes through that lens of metaphor. And take us to some dark places sometimes before we kind of find our way back to the hope at the end of the day. It is sort of, at least speaking from, say, the events in the United States in the last couple of years, it's become kind of shockingly apparent that what we considered human rights and sort of hard-won, well-fought human rights could really be revoked at any moment without any remorse. When we are seeing that kind of climate, one of the reasons that I wanted to write Hallowoods as a story was to create something that would hopefully be reassuring or comforting or galvanizing, that hopefully the result of all this exploration and monologuing would be that someone who is trans or who is LGBTQ feels more comfortable in their identity or braver in order to weather what we're going to have to go through over the next years to come. Horror has long been kind of a refuge genre for queer people, for queer storytellers, for queer story enjoyers. And the feeling of being ostracized by your community, or, you know, hunted with torches and pitchforks, or cast out for a secret inner nature. You know, these are themes that have resonated for decades with queer people, even when those stories were not explicitly about queer characters. And so I think it's somewhat natural that over time queer storytellers would latch onto that and kind of make it their own in some way. A concern I often see echoed from especially people who are considering telling a story is like, is there space for this? Is it already too crowded? Would anyone listen? And my advice is always just to ignore those feelings and make the thing and put it out there. No one will be able to talk about the way you feel the way that you do. And no one will have a voice that is quite the same. So there may be people out there who will resonate with what you have to say in a way that is unique from any other show. So I always support more trans storytellers filling the space.
We have a voice and we need to be listened to, whether it be political or, you know, in the art world, is important because we have to be everywhere, because we are everywhere, but we just have to be seen more. So I think it is a huge thing to and I want it to be seen. That's why I'm writing, is because I want to at least be one of the voices that is like, well, hey, hello, listen to us, because it's really important to me. And I think it's, you know, the trans voices are eloquent and they're just needed. They're just needed in the creative space.